Welcome everybody. We're at the tail end of a very nail-biting election in the US. I'm Adam. We've got James Hughes here, who's the Executive Director of the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies, who's also Provost at the University of Massachusetts. So he's second in command at the academic wing over there. Welcome, James. It's great to have you on the show again.
My delight to be back with you, Adam. We had a demonstration yesterday, and there were a series of nationwide demonstrations to demand that every vote be counted. There was a lot of concern in the lead up to the election that Trump might actually be a competent fascist instead of an incompetent fascist. And fortunately, he's turned out to just be an incompetent fascist. So the most of the things that have happened since Election Day have been bluster and marginal legal moves, which are immediately being thrown out. And I think even if something were to go to the Supreme Court, I don't think the court wants to get involved in defending this one. So I think by tomorrow, Biden will be declared the winner. And it was a hell of a lot narrower than it should have been, and a hell of a lot narrower than we expected. But nonetheless, we'll take it.
Okay, why do you think it's narrow? I mean, I've heard that a lot of people thought that the socialism angle was unattractive, and maybe that they thought that Biden would defund the police. And this is what Trump's been pushing out there.
Well, the defund the police issue is an important thing to talk about. I'll point out that the socialist bloc in the U.S. House of Representatives just doubled in size. It had been 4, and now it's 8. And that's on top of the Progressive Caucus, which is the social democratic bloc, you could say, of the U.S. House of Representatives, is the largest caucus within the Democratic Party, and it continues to grow. As well, my organization, Democratic Socialists, we endorsed 30 candidates around the country, and we won 26 of those races. So I think socialism, and there's an interesting poll out today, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is, of course, an anti-communist group, they do an annual survey of Americans, and they ask them how they feel about socialism and communism and capitalism and things like that. And they just released their latest poll results, and they found that support for the term socialism continues to grow in the United States, and that as much as a third of millennials and Gen Zers in the United States now say that they would like to replace capitalism with a socialist economy. So what people mean by that is all over the place. But yes, I mean, socialism turned out to be something that the Republicans thought they could beat up on Biden with, but they never really got good traction on it because, as Bernie pointed out and as Biden pointed out, Biden ain't the socialist. He beat the socialist fair and square. I wish it had turned out differently. I wish we had had a chance to run Bernie against Biden and see what had happened, but that will never happen now. But I think Biden, it was pretty clear to everybody that Biden was not a socialist. And ironically, if you look at Biden's program, it's the most progressive Democratic program any Democrat has ever run on for president. We pushed him significantly to the left on a number of questions, including healthcare. And there's discussions about some of the 100-day agenda that he wanted to enact that would have been truly, groundbreaking. It would have been like the New Deal if he had been able to enact the jobs program and the Green New Deal legislation and so forth, although he doesn't call it Green New Deal. But now the Senate is probably going to be continue to be controlled by the Republicans. So we're going to see a hell of a lot less in terms of legislation, a lot more in terms of executive orders. But one of the consequences of having a fascist breaking all the democratic norms and all the institutions of Washington is that I think it's put a little bit more steel in the spines of Democrats to say, well, you don't like the fact that we want to add extra people to the Supreme Court. Well, screw you. We're going to do that anyway. So I hope we see that kind of steel in the spine. But of course, the cautious voices are already there. They're saying, you know, don't move too far too fast and you'll scare the horses, and no one will ever vote for a Democrat again. So we'll see. But yeah, we're very disappointed. I think the most shocking thing, every international observer will surely agree, unless you're Vladimir Putin, is that after 4 years of every day, multiple times a day, being reminded what an craven, self-centered, idiot, fascist, racist, all the things, he still almost won. And it's like, what the hell is wrong with this country? And the fact that our polls were so wrong again, after we adjusted them all last time, the way I've been trying to think about that part is that the dynamics, the electoral dynamics of fascism are entirely different than the electoral dynamics of liberal versus conservative as they were in the past. What's happened is that social democracy collapsed. And in terms of the Democratic Party's orientation towards working class people and towards redistributive social welfare programs and so forth, all of that collapsed with the Clinton regime. The Clinton being a faint echo, you know, Blair and Clinton being the faint echoes of the turn to the right that Thatcher and Reagan represented. But those, when the Social Democrats, when the Labor Party, when the Australian Labor Party, when all of the Labor parties and Social Democrats around the world started to become neoliberal, they cut loose working class votes. Now, I understand why they did it, because the traditional working class, the blue collar working class, has been shrinking, and the Social Democrats everywhere were looking towards new progressive college educated voters as a new base. You see the kind of dilemma that puts you in the UK, when, you know, half of the Labour Party wanted to stay and half wanted to leave, and the half that wanted to leave were more likely to be the blue collar workers who were the traditional base of the Labor Party. When those folks feel like they've been cut loose, and on top of it, they're being told what gender pronouns they have to use, and they're being told that they have toxic masculinity, which they do, that they're racist, which they are, you know, that they believe crazy religious things, which they do. They are more attracted to fascist politics, and that's what we've seen emerge in lots of places around the world. And the fascist dynamic, it touches into the mobilization potential of the churches. We saw the evangelicals doubling down on Trump in a way that is simply inconceivable, you know, if you would tell the average person 5 years ago, okay, this guy's well known for hanging out with and cheating on his wives with porn stars. He doesn't actually know a single word from the Bible. He's never been to church. He still doesn't attend any churches, you know, and he's going to be the anointed of God. But the churches, the evangelical churches, they tell their people how to vote, and they get them out and they vote. And they have 10 children apiece. So that makes for a very different electoral dynamic. Now, why didn't the polls pick it up? I think there is a general problem with our way of understanding the electorate that is reflected in all the conspiracy theories that are prevalent in American politics, and I know also in Australian politics, that if a Trumper gets called on the phone, they don't know if it's, you know, the secret elders of Zion trying to steal their baby and drain its adrenochrome. So they don't tell the pollsters. We kindly refer to this as the shy Trump voter, that they feel embarrassed. I don't think they feel embarrassed. I think they're paranoid. I think that they don't want to talk to anybody who sounds like they have more than an 8th grade education, because they think that they're going to be laughed at and abused. So at any rate, there's so many things going on. But just finally on the police, I've been a member of Democratic Socialists of America for 40 years. And in 2016, the organization blew up from 6,000 members to now almost 85,000 members. And as a consequence, the old farts like me were suddenly pushed aside by 30-year-old left activists who had all graduated from university and had entirely different orientations, not entirely different, but they had very different orientations to the old farts. And one of the things that they came in with to the 2017 convention that we held was the BLM, the Black Lives Matter position on police and prison abolition, which I guarantee you the average socialist in America over 50, all, 10,000 of us, had never given a lot of thought to because it's a pretty new position. And I still consider it an anarchist position. I think it's ahistorical. I think it's bad public policy. And it's terrible electoral politics to try to run on, we're going to eliminate police and not let all the criminals out of the prisons. That's just not the message to send if you want to have a majoritarian path to socialism. And it's not key to socialism. I mean, what are we going to do with all these Nazis with guns in the United States if we don't have well-armed cops to arrest them and put them in someplace safe, So I have never been that much of a fan of it. Now, in the wake of, so much evidence of racist police brutality in the United States, we do need to have robust police accountability. And I think the compromise position on the left right now is the defund position, because for those who want an eventual path to police abolition and some entirely new way of dealing with community problems, that's kind of a compromise. And for those who just think that the American police have been overly militarized, that they are over prioritized in municipal budgets in comparison to social services, and that police have been forced to do a bunch of things that really public health nurses or other kinds of people should be doing. I think that is a very sensible position. It's still a little hard to explain to people. And the fact that there are communists with hammers and sickles running around saying they want to abolish the police does not help. But nonetheless, or anarchists, whatever flag they wave. But nonetheless, I don't think it had that dramatic an effect on the election. The socialism piece probably continues to be why we lose Florida, because the only thing that keeps Cuban voters in the Republican camp is their anti-communism, because otherwise, why the hell would you, vote for the Republican Party when it's clear that they don't think that you should even be in the country?
Okay, so let's talk about strongman politics. What is the voter attraction to narcissism? I mean, I've looked at it and it seems as though people seem to see Trump walk around with this sort of aura of untouchable impunity. We've seen, like, you've heard the term Teflon Trump. No matter how much wrong he seems to do, his voters will seem to support him, and the news channels, the news outlets out there that support him will think it's a great thing that he's doing all these sorts of things, and nothing seems to stick. I mean, and people feel a lot like maybe this sort of impunity, they'd like it in their side of the boxing ring, their side of the court, so to speak. It's like a great chess piece to have. Does this pay off for him in some ways, do you think? The attraction of, maybe young men to this sort of super Trump Teflon superpower?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on it, because one of the things that happened this election is that compared to 2016, his support among Black and Hispanic men went up after 4 years of the most blatantly racist politician in American politics since Andrew Jackson. There are still 13% of Black American men who think, yeah, he and me, we're just the same, It's like, well, what are you responding to? It's the toxic masculinity, right? On the left, there's been this huge debate about, and this debate goes back to trying to figure out what happened in the 1930s. Why did so many working class Germans and Italians and other kinds of other nationalities flock to their fascisms as opposed to the left? One of the reasons is that fascism offers a lot more emotional meat than the left usually does. The left is saying, whatever you think you should be concerned about, what you should really be concerned about is your wages, your job, your boss, and the structure of power and economics in society. And maybe we'll offer you a couple symbols, some heroic workers marching down the street, a hammer and a sickle or whatever. The fascists have thousands of years of history. They have the weight of traditional gender roles. They have the weight of religion. They have the weight of all the ethnic and linguistic markers of their society to say, if you want to be a part of this idyllic community, you bend the knee. And part of that idyllic community is a community in which men clearly ruled women, right? And some women want that too. So, like Lindsey Graham, the gayest member of the U.S. Congress, he just got reelected, and he gave a talk right before the election where he said the appointment of Amy Barret to our Supreme Court, who is, of course, a rabidly conservative Catholic, shows that you can have 8 children
like
as she does.
Out of A Handmaid's Tale. Right?
Exactly. Well, and not one of the handmaids. She's one of the wives. Anyway, she has 8 kids, and she was a traditional conservative Catholic woman. And so he was saying, look, you can be successful in America and be a traditional woman and have all the, be a hero mother and have all the babies. So that's part of the appeal, both for conservative women, and they just expanded their ranks. The Republicans just elected more conservative women to the House than they've had in the past, as well as to men in general. And the idea that you have, you're fired, and you have hookers on the tap, that he more or less openly acknowledges, oh yeah, I was screwing that hooker 3 months before, while I was married, 3 months before I ran for election, and then I tried to pay her off with campaign funds, and everyone's like, oh yeah, well that's the thing you do. You don't want the hookers coming out and telling their story right before an election. All of that feeds into him being a symbol of the restoration of patriarchy. And that, for me, that's incredibly important, because there are certain kind of orthodox Marxists who want to see all this as coming back to economic insecurity and late stage capitalism. That the only reason workers have crazy conspiracy theory ideas or toxic masculinity or become Nazis is because they're feeling economic insecurity and they're looking for a target, and they haven't yet discovered that it's the ruling class, and they keep blaming all these other groups. No,
you
there's
mentioned
a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. You mentioned late stage capitalism. I mean, I want you to go on, but do you want to describe what you mean by that?
Late stage capitalism's always been a throw off phrase on the left, which it's a reference to the idea that Marx and Engels had, and many Marxists had, that capitalism will go through a series of crises, and eventually a certain set of things will happen structurally that will bring about the end of capitalism. But I think since the 60s, it's taken on a more expansive meaning to include things like surveillance capitalism. What is it when capitalism starts not making money off of things, but off of the aggregation of data about your behavior that then it can sell to others? Those are the firms that are making the most profit under American capitalism aren't making anything. They're just collecting information about us and selling it to others. So I think, you can talk about those kinds of things as late stage capitalism, but whether it's actually a late stage, who knows? It depends on what comes next.
Right. So where were we? I mean, we were talking about like a Trump and toxic masculinity, but there's also this sort of alternative reality that Trump and others are offering that is attractive, and it gives people a sort of certainty in this uncertain world. And while they feel like they need to be attracted to this idea of the Make America Great Again, this vision of America being great, like maybe it was at some stage, but who knows what that stage is. I don't think he's ever really described what that stage is, but yeah, what is it? I mean, why are people attracted to these alternative realities?
Well, there is a common trope that people will bring up, the idea that we all live in bubbles, we all have confirmation bias, none of us are more rational than the other. That is clearly not true. All the research shows that left and right are not symmetric in their practice of intellectual virtues, intellectual humility, or in their informational habits, their epistemic life that they live. So in other words, if you look at the average American conservative, they listen to one TV channel, they have one local right-wing radio talk show on, otherwise, they don't read, and they have a very limited, palette of internet consumption, compared to people on the left who are consuming hundreds of different websites, and there's 50 different channels that they may look at, and they listen to podcasts, they look at YouTube. So just on that, the epistemic diversity on the left is part of this asymmetric problem. And as a consequence, if you come up with a conspiracy theory like QAnon, even though Fox, hasn't formally covered the QAnon thing, but you will never be, if you decide to go down a QAnon rabbit hole, you will never be exposed to a contrary or challenging opinion about all that stuff. You just are able to live in an internet world that seems to you as if it's a lot bigger than it actually is. Now, that said, that piece is true of everybody. And that was one of the reasons why so many people, liberals and the left, woke up on the 4th thinking that we were going to have finally repudiated fascism and Trumpism, and found out no, and in fact we didn't. And I'm a sociologist, so I try to be more acutely aware of this all the time. One of the things that I'm acutely aware of is that there are probably 100 times more men involved in right-wing militias in the United States than there are leftists actually doing anything about revolutionary aspirations, right? If you want to see the actual signs of civil war and civil breakdown, which unfortunately this election did nothing to make less common or less likely, then look no further than the fact that the governor of Michigan was threatened by a fascist militia who were going to kidnap and murder her, and right-wing armed groups right now are attempting to shut down the counting of ballots in 5 different states. So there's nothing on the left like that. We have there's a group of pink pistols in New York City to protect gay bars from anti-gay violence. Okay, great. There's the Socialist Rifle Association, which just passed 1,000 members, while the National Rifle Association has 5 million members still. So there's this huge imbalance, structural imbalance in the left and right of politics in the United States, and it continues out at these extremes. I don't know why I got started talking about guns, but it's been that kind of year, thinking about guns a lot.
Well, I mean, there's probably maybe there might be a chance that there's a few Trump transhumanist supporters.
We know there are
transhumanist.
We know there are Trump transhumanists, man.
Right. So, I mean, what would you say to the more sophisticated Trump supporter in transhumanist circles, or in any circle? What would you say to them to try and get them to think about things in a different way? The ones that do read a lot of, used to read a lot of Reddit when the Donald was still existing, and consume a lot of media.
My son is 10 times the organizer I ever was, and one of the things that he introduced me to as an organizing technique is the one-on-one, to sit down with somebody and have them articulate their life goals and how politics relates to their life goals. I guess I would try to do that if I had the energy, and I guess many of us will need to try to have that conversation with Trumpers and say, look, what is it that is attracting you here, and what are the goals that you think are going to be accomplished? So bringing back my job, you know, like a coal miner. They voted for Trump because he said, I'm going to bring back coal. Well, he didn't. He can't. Most of you knew that he couldn't, but you simply liked having your head patted and being told that he was going to bring back coal. Banning abortion, you know, the fact that so many evangelicals are willing to hold their nose and vote for this guy on that one issue, banning abortion, when even if Amy Coney Barret and the right wing of the court, they are not going to move to the position that the fetus is a person, which would actually ban abortion, right? Or could, even if you say the fetus is a person, you don't necessarily have to ban abortion, but that would be one plausible far right position to take. That's not where they're headed. The most that they're going to do is they're going to say to Alabama, oh, you want to only have abortion after, you know, in the first trimester. That's fine with us. You can do that. Or you have to have 10 doctors on staff at every abortion clinic. That's something Texas, you know, did to try to shut down abortion clinics there. And they'll say that's fine with that, which means there'll be abortion on the coasts and in some, you know, big cities in Chicago and places like that. And there won't be abortion clinics in the religious South. That's not banning abortion. That's restricting abortion. It's terrible, but it's not banning abortion. So, you know, if you talk to them about their goals, I think you might be able to convince them. But frankly, I gave up a long time ago. I have a couple Trumpers that I grew up with and one in my family that it's impossible to have a conversation with them because they don't talk sense. They send you conspiracy theory links that you can immediately disprove or that show that they're false, but they don't care. They live in an emotive bubble where he makes them feel good because he's not a liberal elite talking down to me. He's like a man like me. And how do you crack through that? I don't know.
Who do you think would know? Who do you think would be good at doing that sort of thing?
Look, here's the best case scenario after we didn't get the best case scenario. I think the best case scenario is that Trump reaps all of the legal trouble that he has been putting off by being president, all the court cases that are going to start piling up on him. Even if he were to, for instance, which some have suggested, that he might step aside the next month or two and let Pence become president so Pence could pardon Trump for his federal crimes. There's still the state court of New York, as well as other cases around the country, that he can't be pardoned for. So he could go to prison. He could pay heavy fines. Now, in retrospect, if the Trumpers didn't care about all the other stuff, they probably won't care about that either. But Deutsche Bank, he owes $1 billion to Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank is apparently considering repossessing all of his properties after he leaves the presidency. That, I think that might do it. You know, if he's not a rich man anymore. But there is a precedent for fascist dynasties in politics. Mussolini's granddaughter was a fascist politician with the Northern League in Italy, and now she's a part of, let's see, well, she started her own fascist party and then she joined the Northern League, which is also a fascist party. And there are people like that around the world. Marie Le Pen in France, she inherited Jean Le Pen, her father's fascist party. It was a very small, marginal party. She gave it a lick and a polish, and now it's the third major party in France. So I think it's quite possible that Ivanka and his idiot sons will try to run for something, and hopefully they will be successful.
What makes you think that they might?
They said that, well, the boys have said that they will. Ivanka has been groomed to be the inheritor of Trump's whatever it is. So we'll see.
Do you think people will see Ivanka as being like filling the role that Trump had? Or will she just be a different type of politician that they're attracted to? What's so attractive about like having Ivanka?
Well, clearly she's smarter than he is. So I think she will be able to navigate. She'll go back to dog whistling instead of bullhorning. You know, Trump, the only one of the few good things about Trump was that he always said the quiet part out loud. You know, he always said, instead of "we're concerned about the integrity of the election process," what he would say is, the Democrats will try to stuff ballots if we allow mail-in voting, and that's bad for the Republicans. Instead of saying, you know, yes, of course, police accountability is important, and all the bad things we've seen are just a few bad apples. He's saying we should beat the crap out of more people. Get those cops out there with more nightsticks and just shoot them in the street. So I think the advantage Ivanka would have, if she were legitimately anointed as a successor to lead the Trumpist mob, is that she would have the intelligence not to say some of those stupid things, and that might carve off a little bit more independent or moderate support. But you know, the whole idea of independents and moderates, I think, is bullshit anyway. The most independents and moderates in the United States lean one direction or the other. They just don't like the idea of political parties. But there has been a substantial realignment towards Trumpism on the part of new constituencies of voters, and we're going to have to deal with that for a while.
It's been said that if Trump loses this election, which, as you said, will probably happen, he might try and run again in 2024. Given the legal obstacles that he'll probably be facing once he leaves the presidency, do you think that that's a concern that people should be worried about?
I can't believe he's lived this long. I mean, the guy has the least healthy lifestyle of an American president since, who knows, 100 years ago. And he's old, and I don't see it. I don't see him running again. He's going to be too old. He's not going to be favored within the party. I mean, the GOP, let's be honest, GOP electeds hate him. There are very few GOP electeds who are really Kool-Aid drinking true believers in Trumpism. The majority of them said that he was a huckster and a liar before he got the nomination, and have indicated in many subtle ways, far too subtle, but many subtle ways, that they don't want to go down the Trumpist road. So he's not going to get a lot of encouragement. Even the people who worked for him all leave the White House and say that's the craziest person I've ever had to work for. So I don't think he's going to get a lot of encouragement, but Trumpism is obviously still an ongoing thing. The GOP is going to have to figure out what they do with that. They want that kind of support. They want these kinds of astonishing electoral miracles to continue. Whether they can do that without him at the helm and somebody not kinder and nicer and more manipulable, we'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what general things would you like to see the Democrats do to increase the odds of being able to carry the torch for another 4 years if Biden does indeed win this?
As I said, we thought we might take the Senate, in which case we would have had at least a good chance of enacting a pretty progressive agenda. Not as progressive as Bernie Sanders would have had, but a very progressive agenda. Most of that agenda is now dead in the water if we don't take the Senate. However, the American presidency, is one of the most powerful executives in the world, other than monarchies. It has a president can appoint all kinds of very important officials. One of the huge advantages of having Trump as our first fascist president was that he was too stupid to actually do what he could have to transform the federal machine into an actual fascist machine. He tried appointing his various cronies and buddies, but it was more cronies and buddies than actual fascist ideologues. Barr, at the head of the American justice system, clearly was willing to break a lot of norms and rules. He defended Trump against rape accusations when, you know, he's the lawyer for the presidency, not for Trump, but he acted as if he was Trump's personal lawyer, going and getting pardons for Trump's indicted co-conspirators and all these kinds of things. So, you know, Barr, Bannon, Steve Miller, there are a number of ideological fascists in this administration, but Trump was never disciplined enough to say, okay, we're going to reenact, you know, I don't know if you know about COINTELPRO, but during the 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover had a program through the FBI to infiltrate left-wing organizations, to spread disinformation about them, to have agents provocateur start violent acts that they could be arrested for, all these kinds of things. Trump really didn't do that. I mean, he shut down the white supremacy, the part of the Justice Department that was tracking and attempting to infiltrate white supremacists. He didn't want his Nazi buddies to be infiltrated or shut down until they started to actually blow shit up in the last year. But other than that, he hasn't really used the full power of the state. And I think, you know, we kind of have Google and Facebook and Twitter to thank for the fact that he wasn't able to, because we have communication platforms we wouldn't have had access to in, for instance, the 1960s. We have private corporate agencies that have more information about us than any government dossier maker could ever dream of. And it's relatively protected from, you know, federal agencies that might misuse that kind of information. So, you know, this has just been an incompetent fascist regime. I forget what your original question was, but that is a huge advantage to have them not do the things they could. And, okay, well, just back to the Biden presidency. The presidency is an incredibly powerful post, and American historians refer to it now as the imperial presidency, that with every administration since the 60s, the powers of the presidency have grown. The number of federal employees that the presidency, the executive branch controls, have grown. The ability to engage in war. You know, we haven't had a formal declaration of war since the Korean War or something. So we've been able to do Vietnam and every other military incursion without formal declarations of war. And now we've got drones and autonomous and cyber warfare and autonomous lethal weapons. So you don't even need to you don't even need the vote to send American troops someplace. You can just send a drone and kill a bunch of people. So I'm not saying that that's what I'm hoping that Biden does, but I'm just saying that capturing the presidency can be an incredibly powerful post. And one of the complaints that the Republicans had about Obama was that after they took the House and the Senate and started blocking everything that Obama wanted to do, Obama started using those powers. He did the Dreamers program. So kids who have been brought to the United States by undocumented immigrants, but who had lived here since they were children, Obama just said, as a matter of executive action, we're not going to prosecute these people, we're not going to throw them out of the country, and we're going to give them a path to citizenship if they go to college or if they serve in the military, et cetera, et cetera. And that really annoyed the Republicans. But you know whose fault it was? It's the Republicans' fault, because we were trying to get immigration reform forever. You know, George W. Bush wanted immigration reform that we could have signed on to. And you refused to have immigration reform, and you left us no choice but to use the powers of the presidency. That's where we're going to be for the next 2 years. Now, in 2 years, in 2022, the Republicans will have to defend 22 senatorial seats to the Dems only having to defend 12. And I think we could have a chance. Now, it's always usually the opposition, the party that holds the presidency usually loses seats in a midterm election. But if things are as crazy as they probably will be, and the economic depression that we're certain to have because of COVID and so forth, I think it's quite possible we could take the Senate, and then we'll see what kind of agenda we can enact.
Okay, so what about technoprogressive transhumanist goals and transhumanist goals in general? What can people do to increase, I guess, political awareness of these sorts of things? And
well, let me just dilate on that for well, I'll dilate on it as long as you want. But yeah, back in when I wrote Citizen Cyborg, I have always been interested as a philosopher, as someone who's trying to do philosophy and political science and social science, my own way. One of the questions I've always been fascinated by is when people start to think about things like human enhancement, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, space exploration, all the tech issues, how do they put the pieces together? What is the cognitive framework where they decide I'm for this and I'm against this, and that means I should also be for this and against this? Bruce Sterling was one of the people who first got me thinking about this, the science fiction author, because he wrote a series of short stories called Schismatrix, where he imagined a future post-humanity where half of us start doing all the gene tweaking and tissue engineering and things like that, but we don't do too much cyber augmentation, and the other half do all cyber augmentation. I thought, well, that's interesting. Is it really true? That was one of the first studies I did in graduate school. I looked at survey data and I said, are people who favor genetic engineering any less likely to favor putting a chip in your head or vice versa? No, in fact, if you favor putting a chip in your head, you're also probably going to favor genetic engineering. So that was when I first started to think, well, maybe these technology issues are going to form this new axis in the way that we think about politics, so that you could be a fascist and a Luddite, or a fascist and a pro-technology person, transhumanist, or you could be a socialist and a pro-technology or socialist. And it seemed like in the 2000s, it seemed like there were people, there were intellectuals, there were books, there were organizations that were representing this kind of emerging three-dimensional landscape of very complicated techno-political relationships. Well, guess what? All of that was a mirage, because what really happened over the last 2 decades is that the people who are the champions of Enlightenment values, and when I say Enlightenment values, I mean science, reason, empiricism, the techno-optimism that the advance of technology is good for society, as well as individual liberties, and a general understanding that society should be governed through the consent of the governed, and democracy, broadly thinking democracy. Now, if on the side of the cultural values of the Enlightenment, we are still fighting these things. We still are fighting over gender and religion versus secularism and nationalism versus internationalism and all these things. These are all still ongoing fights. And I thought that technology might be orthogonal to those fights. They're not. If you are wearing a mask in the United States right now, you are declaring, I am on the left, I care about science and reason, I believe experts, I don't believe crazy conspiracy theories, and fuck you. And if you're not wearing a mask, you're saying the opposite. So around the world, I think it's clear that the forces of reaction are also anti-science forces. Now, that comes in many different shapes. They're certainly not anti-science in the sense of wanting to ban a lot of stuff, because usually they are also very friendly to corporations and free markets and things like that. But in terms of who is it that is most anxious and most opposed to transhumanist public policy goals in Western publics, it's the religious, the hardcore blue-collar religious constituencies in those countries, because they have some notion that it would violate God's plan if you stick a chip in your head or your kids were smarter. So I think that it's only even though there are people in the left who have a lot of concerns about exacerbation of inequality or the safety of food, drugs, and devices, whatever complaint they might have with a particular transhumanist innovation. In general, the left and liberal forces in the Western world are the ones who are going to accelerate the technoprogressive ends, and the conservatives, and just look at this administration for an example. Every scientist who had the temerity to say anything different than the insanity that was coming out of his mouth was fired. The entire federal science bureaucracy has been sidelined, discouraged, forced out of office. The CDC is in shambles. The National Institutes of Health is in shambles. The Food and Drug Administration is in shambles. The EPA is in shambles. So if you think that all science can be done by self-funded people in their garage, and that the way that we're going to have human genetic engineering is that people are just going to start shooting themselves up with CRISPR kits, more power to you. But if you think that science is actually a collective endeavor that requires a functioning society and a functioning federal government, I have some bad news for you, because that's where we just went wrong.
And a trust
Hopefully
in science.
Biden will start to put that all back.
I mean, there's a lot of people who just lost a lot of trust in the scientific enterprise, it seems. A lot of people just don't want to believe what Fauci has been saying about how to deal with the pandemic, and instead want to listen to what Trump has said or what his aides are saying. And what do you say to that? How do you convince those sort of people to cross the line and actually support science?
If any of the Trumpers had really, or any of the fascist anti-mask people all around the world who are now repeating Trumpist QAnon conspiracies and all the, it's become an international phenomenon. If any of them were really willing to have a debate about the consequentialist ethics of whether sacrificing 2 million American senior citizens in order to maintain our economy made sense, which when 2 million people die in your society, is bad for your economy. It's just, there's no way around it. It's going to be bad for your economy, and people aren't going to be going to restaurants, whether they're open or not. But if we had wanted to have that debate, and I was prepared to have that debate. Look, I'm a philosopher. I'll talk about anything. Should we sacrifice grandma in order to bring the crops next year? Sure, why not? Let's talk about that. But that's not the debate they wanted to have. They wanted to invent all these reasons why liberals somehow had nefarious plans to get a chip into you through the vaccines, and to cause people to die by having to breathe their own carbon monoxide, whatever their crazy ideas were that they had. So no, Jesus, don't get me started. But yeah, COVID, I think, is a huge wake-up call that a society that does not take scientific empiricism seriously is digging its own grave.
Right. Can you give me a bit of an update of what IEET are doing, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology?
Sure. IEET, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a nonprofit that Nick Bosserman and I started 15 years ago. We were both involved in the World Transhumanist Association at the time, which is now known as Humanity Plus. And we wanted to start a think tank to bring together people who broadly agreed that there should be governments, and that government public policy should ensure that human enhancement was safe and effective. And, we didn't agree about much more than that, but that position has gradually evolved into what we call the technoprogressive position. And we had an agenda for about 10 years of conferences and fellows and affiliates and so forth. That I'm pretty happy with what we accomplished during those 10 years. In 2015, 2016, we ran out of money, And then in 2016, all hell broke loose all over the world. Brexit and Trump and Modi and Putin and Duterte and Erdogan and Orban, et cetera, et cetera. So I basically pulled people informally and I said, look, I just don't feel it anymore. It seems like trying to talk about the issues of the 2030s when people are trying to drag us back to the 1930s is a pretty, head in the sand position to take. So if we're going to have an IET agenda, it has to be thinking about how the technoprogressive agenda relates to fighting fascism around the world. And people said what I think is probably, I still think is true, which is that one of the reasons why the left has been vulnerable to the erosion that it's faced is that it hasn't come up with a new understanding, a 21st century understanding of what the left project should be about, right? And I mentioned earlier the distinctive advantage that fascism has for electoral mobilization and for popular support, because it uses so many emotive symbols that are a part of people's society and history. For the left to actually combat that, it has to either go the nationalist route and say, to be a true American, you have to be a socialist, which I don't think is going to work here. Or you have to come up with new symbols. You have to come up with a new vision, something that's equally exciting about a united world, about a world where we've defeated climate change, about a world that sends people to Mars, about a world that where all of our children can be smart and beautiful. I think those are the kinds of visions that actually could unite people. So I do think the techno-progressive set of questions and the way that we're trying to think about the relationship between technological progress is a lot more exciting than the default left Luddism that a lot of people fall into, where they just say everything, no to anything that's produced by corporate modernity. Okay, so, but the more interesting recent news about the IET is that we got a big bequest recently, and we are going to be starting a series of postdocs at my university, which you can see behind my head. That's University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I work. And I'm now an ethics fellow at the Center for Applied Ethics at our university, as well as associate provost. And so we'll be basing the IAT fellowship program at my university, but also holding conferences. And we are just created a new website. So we're relaunching basically, and we're going to try to figure out how to be more focused, but I have to say my interests continue to be as expansive as they ever were. So I'm not bringing any focus, but hopefully we will find some focus. So good news on the IET front. Thanks for letting me share.
Oh yeah, absolutely fantastic. That is. Can I ask how much of a bequest that was?
Yes, you can. It will be public information whenever I file the taxes, but it's $1.1 million. That was before the stock market collapse, so maybe a little bit less now. But
well, that's amazing. Congratulations on that. I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, let's discuss a couple of things. There's a few things I wanted to discuss with you before the end of this interview, and that is like the contrasting positions that Biden is putting out, and that is of unity, and the other one, of course, Trump is putting out that is against like isolationism and division. Obviously, they're both very attractive narratives. A lot of people don't want to share the country at all with the opposing political side.
So I'm going to go back to Bernie for a second. It's too early to tell whether these electoral results are a vindication of the Bernie-crat wing of the party or a repudiation. You started at the top by saying, well, was it the anti-police and pro-socialism message that made this such a close election? That's not my interpretation of what happened. But there are cases where it appears particular races around the country where it appears that a Bernie-crat message was less successful than we expected. And the part of the logic of the Democratic left has been, okay, you're confronting this incredibly divisive figure. Do you come out with the message, oh, we should all set aside our differences and just be Americans again? Or do you acknowledge that there's a hell of a lot wrong and that people are very angry, and that the way you fight racism and patriarchy and all the things that this represents is with class war? That, you know, the only way to get back these angry blue-collar religious workers is to convince them that you are as sincere a warrior on their behalf as they attribute to this fascist lump of lard called Trump. So I thought that that kind of a campaign, a Bernie-crat campaign, would have won. Now, it did not win sufficient support in the Democratic primaries. Black voters in particular were attracted to Biden because he was the vice president for America's first black president. And they trusted him. And they didn't at all mind that he had a history of endorsing racist legislation, criminal law reform, which ended up putting millions of Black Americans in prison and so forth. They didn't mind that. In the first place, most Black Americans want more police in their neighborhoods, right? So every time the left said Biden is a cop lover, Kamala's a cop because she was a prosecutor. Guess what? Black Americans like that. They have always thought that there weren't enough police in their neighborhood. Yes, they don't like it when racist cops do bad things, but they want more cops. So at any rate, a lot of our left-wing theory of how the electorate might behave if we gave them real raw meat socialist policy didn't pan out. And what Biden represented was a return to normalcy. I mean, he almost literally hid for the last 6 months as an election strategy because Trump was doing all the campaigning that needed to be done. Trump was demonstrating to the country how chaotic and idiotic he was. And what more can you say? So now I think there's still a huge problem because Biden and that wing of the Democratic Party, the reason why they don't like talking about division is also because they want to tamp down the class struggle aspects of things that are happening on the Democratic side. We have a demand that no corporate lobbyists, Trump said he was going to drain the swamp. And what he actually did was appoint every lobbyist who had ever argued for the abolition of a federal agency to be the director of that agency. So there's been a huge amount of corruption in this administration. We think that Biden should not appoint any corporate lobbyists to his cabinet. It seems like a straightforward proposition, but this is a shot across the bow as far as the bankers and corporate folks who have backed Biden are concerned. So that, what I'm saying is I don't mind that Biden ran as the normalcy, return to calm candidate. I'm going to unite and represent everybody. It obviously worked. It worked for him. Mm. But as a governance strategy, it's absolutely clear that that's not the right way to meet the Republicans toe to toe. They'll just steamroller over anything that you try to do if you're going to be the nice guy, the rational guy. We need to learn to play hard knuckle politics the same way the Republicans have been doing to us for decades now.
Sure.
It's not the right way to engage in policy in terms of our relationship to banks and corporations. We need more progressive taxation. We need more government regulation. We need to move past the opposition to the expansion of health insurance in the country. We need to have a national infrastructure jobs program. All of these things are going to take bruised egos on the part of corporate and wealthy backers of the Democratic Party. And I don't know that Biden's ready to engage in that fight yet, but we'll see.
What about Kamala? She seems a bit more sort of feisty, can we say?
I think, Kamala has not been known as a left politician. She represents California. So as a California Democrat, she is clearly very progressive on many social issues, not necessarily on corporate regulation and redistribution issues. She did signal support for the phrase Medicare for All, which is our universal health care proposal. And then she backed off. She waffled on that. So we'll just have to see with Kamala. I expect Kamala to be president before 2024. I expect Joe's not going to make it that long.
Wow.
So we'll just have to see.
That's why do you think it's just too old, or what? What is it?
I think there actually are signs of cognitive decay. Now, people think that Reagan had Alzheimer's, detectable Alzheimer's in his first term, and that his second term was carefully stage managed so that his Alzheimer's was not visible. I don't think it's hard to tell with Joe Biden because he actually has had a stutter his entire life, and so sometimes his verbal tics are the result of his attempting to work past his stutter. But I think it's also very clear that he's not the man that he was, and that there's a certain amount of cognitive decay, and we'll just have to see how severe it is. I think he has signaled that partly the reason he chose a younger woman of color like Kamala was that he represents, as he has called it, a bridge to a new generation. He represents that the Democratic Party is moving to already well to his left, and that he was not a favored candidate, and no one under 40 wanted him as the Democratic Party's candidate. It was solely older voters, and especially older Black female voters, who chose Joe Biden to be the Democratic Party candidate. So I think our party, the Democrats, have to wrap their mind around demographic realities the same way the GOP does. The weird upshot or silver lining of this Trumpist, unexpected, narrow election result is that the GOP, I'm sure, were, for the most part, the elected officials were, for the most part, thinking, oh my God, let's have a complete repudiation of Trump. We'll finally be rid of this troublesome priest. He'll go to prison, and that'll be the end of it. And we can get back to being traditional conservatives, which means we dog whistle, we don't bullhorn. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to be their luck, because Trump is going to be, he's going to set himself up as president in exile, and his whole dynasty is going to be a pain in the Republican ass for a long time. And every tweet that he sends out is going to send Republican congressmen scurrying. So, but on the Democratic side, you know, Nancy Pelosi's she's like 79 years old. The top three people, the top three Democratic legislators in the House are all in their 60s and 70s. The squad are all in their 20s and 30s, you know, the left-wing legislators that we identify with. Mm-hmm. So it's clear that in both cases, the Republicans need to purge themselves of Trumpism, which is just going to lead them into an early electoral grave because of the changing demographics of the United States. And the Democrats have to get younger and lefter in order to hold on to very left-wing millennial and Gen Z electorate.
Right. Okay. I wanted to discuss fake news and I guess emerging technologies that are going to be make that a lot easier to achieve. So things like a text generation software. I'm sure you're across and aware of GPT-3, which does produce very interesting output a lot of the time, and deepfakes technology, and where this might head in the future. It may not be there yet to convince the masses of things that don't actually exist, but I'm sure it would convince some people.
I think in this case, the concern about fake news and technology in particular suffers from the ahistoricity that a lot of technology moral panics suffer from. In other words, if you go back in the history of literacy, whenever there was a mass communication medium, the printing press, the very first picture that apparently was printed on a printing press was an engraving of an alleged comet that struck in France. And it was attached to a story that argued that this comet was a sign of God's disfavor for the local lord or whoever it was, whoever they were talking about in that story. So the very first use of an image from a printing press was fake news. And the entire history of journalism through the present has been 90% fake news, cooked up for one religious, political, or just simply sensationalist tabloid reason or another. So we tend to have this glorified, things were so much better when everyone was Edgar R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite. And it's like, no, the reason we know their names is because the rest of them were not Edgar R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite. And so I'm not as concerned about this as I think others are. In fact, I think what I was referencing earlier is that the studies show that the epistemic diversity of information sources that most people rely on today is 1,000, 1,000,000 times bigger than what it would have been for our ancestors 100 or 200 years ago. When one day we get exposed to more information than the average French peasant ever would have known about in their entire life. So yes, we have problems parsing it all. And do I find myself occasionally reposting something that turns out to be an Onion article or, these days, who can tell? You see Trump says that there's UFOs and that he's going to marry a unicorn. Who knows? Maybe today that's what he said, So I think we all have information literacy problems. And I am actually encouraged by the fact that Twitter and Facebook are trying to figure out artificial intelligence tools, which would allow, trying to do this with human labor, as they found when they tried to tamp down racist fear-mongering in places like Burma against the Rohingya, or other countries where Facebook was being used to organize fascist mob violence. It takes, just for Burma, I think they had to hire like 100 Burmese language experts to read all the stuff that was happening on Burmese Facebook. So that's not a sustainable solution. What you need is artificial intelligence that flags keywords and everything. Then you'll get into the situation the Chinese are in, which is that the Chinese have that sophisticated great firewall software. And they will issue a diktat. Today, no one is allowed to say bad things about Chairman Xi. Okay, well, we'll start talking about Winnie the Pooh. No, well, today you're not allowed to talk about Winnie the Pooh. Okay, well, we're going to use this one word which sounds a little bit like Xi Jinping. Well, you're not allowed to use that word anyway. So this is a whack-a-mole game that totalitarian regimes are playing with electronic communications, but it beats the hell out of sending them all to prison. So I don't think the problem with contemporary epistocracy, that is having a democracy where people are governed by actual facts and not just by feelings, I don't think that the problem with that is the diversity of information. I think we do have a problem with information literacy, a problem we've always had, and it's more acute now because we have so many more sources of information. Now, all of that said, I do think the weaponization of propaganda and the weaponization of personality profiling, which we saw in 2016 with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and the growing capacity of Google's and Facebook's and Twitter's and everybody else to build profiles and know, it's like, well, this one's not concerned about abortion, but tell this one that Trump wants to ban TikTok, and then they'll go vote. Knowing the exact precise triggers that everyone has to mobilize them in one direction or another, I do worry about that growing sophistication, and that when you add chatbots and GPT-3 and things like that on top of it, the ability to have not only a meme go out to people who you know are going to be influenced by that meme, but also have, you know, fake chatbots, or, you know, all these Twitter bots that have to constantly be exposed and expunged. You know, they're just retweeting things from different sources. But then if you were to put, you know, a GPT-3 behind that, it'd be all that much more complicated to eradicate. So yes, I do worry about the growing sophistication of that. But I think in the end, as with everything, it comes down to money and power. And if we have a more egalitarian distribution of money and power in our societies, we'll at least have a more egalitarian use of the tools to defraud and misinform each other. So,
Indeed. How do you hope the next 4 years will turn out? What can we do to nudge the next 4 years and beyond so that we achieve the technoprogressive transhumanist goals that a lot of us are looking forward to and hoping for?
Well, let's talk about the technological side. I think there's a long conversation to be had about technological determinism and the kind of techno-optimistic trajectories that a lot of futurists have adopted. And these last 4 years of societal dysfunction, COVID, unpredictable black swan events of all kinds have, I think, chastened some of that confidence that technological trajectory would be uncomplicated and exponential, et cetera, et cetera. If we have major social disruption from plagues, wars, depressions, and so forth, it will have an impact on technological innovation. Kurzweil has gone to great lengths to show us that it doesn't have that much of an impact. And I do think we're probably still on track for super miniaturized nanotechnology that will do lots of cool stuff within a decade or two, et cetera, quantum computing, and so forth. All the things that transhumanists have been expecting are going to come. What they weren't expecting is that they might come into a world where there is war, more terrorism, more social dysfunction, more inequality, where stable democracies are no longer so stable, where totalitarianism in the Chinese form, technocratic capitalist totalitarianism, or the religious forms of Muslim totalitarianism, or an American Taliban totalitarianism, whatever it is, all of those are going to be on the comeback and are going to be technologically enabled, right? We knew for a long time that it was possible that you could use biotech to engineer a plague that would only attack a certain racial group, right? That was considered by the apartheid regime, certain researchers who were working for the apartheid regime in South Africa, that they might just have to eliminate all the black people. But any side could do that in the future, right? The dangerous world that Savulescu and Pearson warned about, where they said that it may be that we have to force everybody to take nice, happy drugs in the future because everyone could be a potential world-destroying terrorist. That world's coming, and I don't think any of those questions have gone away. Now, that I'll mention parenthetically that I've been trying to finish Cyborg Buddha for a long time, and the last 5 years have not been friendly to my thoughts about this topic, because writing a book about how cool it would be if we all had drugs to change our personalities doesn't seem quite so cool when totalitarianism is on the rise. The Soviet Union used psychiatric institutions extensively to imprison their political opponents and reorient their thinking. China has 1 million Uyghurs and 500,000 Tibetans in political re-education camps right now. And so I think we need to give a hell of a lot of thought about what a totalitarianism in the future that actually makes the full use of neurotechnologies, what that would look like, because it's not going to be pretty. So I think none of our problems are going away. They're all just getting worse. And the technologies just raise the stakes for for us solving all of these problems.
Oh, absolutely, indeed. I'm very much looking forward to where the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies goes in the next few years. I'm interested in finding out what the topics of your doctorate students
First one's AI and work. We're focused. The first postdoc is going to focus on automation and work, and of course, the challenge is to find something that's new to say in this domain, because it's that is well-trodden territory. But I think there are going to be some new, interesting questions we can ask.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for being on the show again. I encourage everybody to check out the Institute for Emerging Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which is IEET.org. And also subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't already. So thanks heaps for listening, everybody. And
good to see you again, Adam.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Anytime.
Been a while.